1.9 billion people around the world have become obsessed with Marvel's legacy heroes. And every single one of these stories began with one man who was about to quit his job at a tiny comic book company that was about to go bankrupt. But his dream wasn't to create superheroes. Following his wife's unexpected advice, he instead built something nobody saw coming. This is the story of how a failed novelist named Stanley Lieber became Stan Lee. In the 1930s, America is still struggling with the aftermath of the Great Depression. Newspapers and magazines were filled with stories of criminals, gangsters, and outlaws like Bonnie and Clyde. People needed heroes, even if it was just on paper. That's when a new form of entertainment began capturing America's imagination. In 1938, two Jewish teenagers, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, created a character for Detective Comics that would change everything. Superman, an alien with incredible powers dedicated to protecting humanity, became an instant sensation. Suddenly, publishers everywhere wanted their own superheroes. One of these publishers was a magazine businessman named Martin Goodman. Goodman operated a small publishing company originally called Timely Comics. His first release, Marvel Comics #1, featured characters like the Human Torch and Submariner, but they weren't nearly as popular as DC's heroes. Goodman needed help to compete in this new market, and that's where our main character enters the picture. Stanley Martin Lieber was born on December 28, 1922 in Manhattan to Romanian Jewish immigrant parents. Son of a dress cutter who struggled to find work during the Depression, young Stanley was a passionate reader and movie fan, especially for films starring Errol Flynn. He devoured Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, and Arthur Conan Doyle, dreaming of becoming a serious writer himself. In 1939, 16-year-old Stanley graduated from DeWitt Clinton High School in the Bronx. Like many teenagers during this era, he needed a job immediately to support his family. But how did a teenager with dreams of writing novels end up in comics? The answer involves family connections and a stroke of luck. Stanley's uncle, Robbie Solomon, worked with Martin Goodman's publishing company. When he heard they needed an assistant, he helped his nephew get an interview. The moment Stanley walked through the doors of Timely Comics, he had no idea he was stepping into his destiny. He was hired on the spot for $8 a week as an office gopher. His duties were to fill inkwells, erase pencil marks, fetch lunch for the staff, and occasionally proofread. Not exactly the novelist career he had imagined. The office was tiny but full of creativity. It was there that Stanley met with the two men who ran the creative side of the company, editor Joe Simon and art director Jack Kirby. But the big life changer of Stanley came 2 years later. Joe Simon gave the eager teenager a chance to write a short text story for Captain America Comics #3. For this story, Stanley used the pen name Stan Lee, saving his real name for when he'd write his serious novel. The comic wasn't revolutionary, but it marked the first professional writing credit for a future legend. Soon after this, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby left Timely for DC Comics after a dispute with Goodman. Suddenly, 19-year-old Stan Lee found himself promoted to interim editor, making him the youngest editor in the comic industry. For the young Stan, this sudden promotion was both thrilling and overwhelming. Now he controlled an entire publishing division with barely 2 years of experience. But just as Stan's career was taking off, a world event got in the way. Stan enlisted in the Army Signal Corps in 1942, where his writing talents were quickly recognized. Assigned to the training film division alongside fellow creators like Theodore Geisel, he wrote manuals, training films, and even created cartoons for military publications. After serving in the U.S. Army during World War II, Stan returned to find the comic book landscape had changed dramatically. During the war, superheroes with patriotic themes like Captain America had thrived. But when the war ended, interest in these characters declined sharply. To stay aloft, comic publishers pivoted to other genres, westerns, romance, horror, and science fiction. Stan Lee, now the full editor-in-chief of what was renamed Atlas Comics, struggled to keep the company relevant. Things got even worse in 1954 when psychiatrist Frederick Wertham published a book called Seduction of the Innocent, claiming comics corrupted America's youth. Wertham's claims led to Senate hearings and resulted in the creation of Comics Code Authority, a strict self-censorship system that severely limited what comics could contain. Many publishers went out of business. Atlas Comics barely survived by publishing whatever might sell: monster stories, cowboy tales, and teenage horror comics.
I have a dream. They go to the car. Now they are waving, and here comes Jackie waving by.
7 years later, Stan Lee was approaching 40 years old. He had spent over 20 years in an industry he never intended to join, writing stories he wasn't passionate about, and he was still no closer to writing his novel. Lee later recalled, "I was ready to quit. My wife, Joan, could see I was unhappy and said, 'Why don't you write one comic book the way you'd like to, instead of the way Martin wants you to? What's the worst that could happen? He'll fire you, but you want to quit anyway.'" This conversation would change everything. 1961. After DC's success with their Justice League superhero team, Martin Goodman instructed Lee to create a similar team for Atlas. But instead of creating flawless superheroes like Superman, Stan Lee decided to try something completely different. Stan Lee teamed up with artist Jack Kirby, who had come back to the company to create the Fantastic Four, a team of flawed, complicated heroes who argued, got sick, paid bills, and dealt with everyday problems alongside their superhero adventures. This was revolutionary. Before this, superheroes were essentially perfect beings without real-world problems. Lee's characters felt like real people with superpowers, not gods pretending to be human. Readers loved this. The Fantastic Four was a hit. After seeing the success of this new style, the company changed its name one last time in the same year. Atlas Comics became Marvel Comics, matching Stan Lee's idea for a fresh start. Lee and Kirby followed it up with a flood of new characters. The Hulk, a scientist transformed into a monster by gamma radiation. Thor, the Norse god of thunder walking among mortals. Iron Man, a genius inventor with a damaged heart who builds a suit to stay alive. But Lee's most successful creation came 1 year later, when he and artist Steve Ditko introduced a character that would become Marvel's icon. Spider-Man was a teenage science nerd who gained powers after being bitten by a radioactive spider. Unlike other teen characters who are usually sidekicks, Peter Parker was the hero himself. What made Spider-Man truly special was his relatability. He struggled with money, had girl problems, dealt with bullies, and worried about his aging aunt. As Peter Parker himself said, "With great power comes great responsibility." Lee revolutionized comic book storytelling in other ways too. He created what came to be known as the Marvel Method. Instead of writing full scripts, Lee would give an artist a plot outline. The artist would then draw the story, and Lee would add dialogue afterward. This gave artists more creative input and allowed Marvel to produce comics faster. Another Lee innovation was talking directly to readers through editorial notes and fan clubs like the Merry Marvel Marching Society. Marvel wasn't just selling comics, they were building a community. Readers felt like they were part of something special, talking the same language, getting the inside jokes, and being what Stan called true believers. By the late 1960s, Marvel had overtaken DC in popularity. College students were analyzing Marvel Comics as modern mythology. The once struggling publisher was now a cultural phenomenon. But despite this incredible success, trouble was brewing behind the scenes. As Marvel's success grew, so did tensions over credit and compensation. Artists like Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko felt they weren't receiving proper recognition for their creative contributions. While Stan Lee was becoming the face of Marvel in the media, the artists who co-created these iconic characters worked in the background for a lower pay. Both Kirby and Ditko eventually left Marvel, creating a separation that would never fully heal. The question of who deserves credit for creating Marvel's iconic characters remains controversial to this day. Lee stopped writing comics to become Marvel's publisher, overseeing the entire creative process of the company. Throughout the 1970s, Marvel expanded its line with new characters like Wolverine and teams like the New Mutants. The 1980s saw comics mature with groundbreaking works like Frank Miller's Daredevil and Chris Claremont's Uncanny X-Men, which introduced complex themes and sophisticated storytelling. Comics were no longer just for kids. They were addressing serious topics like racism, drug addiction, and political corruption. The industry was also changing. Comic book specialty stores created a direct market system, allowing publishers to sell directly to dedicated fans rather than just through newsstands. By the early 1990s, Marvel seemed unstoppable. In 1991, a new X-Men #1 sold an unprecedented 8 million copies, still the best-selling comic book of all time. Marvel went public in the same year and its stock soared. But beneath the surface, a perfect storm was brewing that could threaten the future of the company. The 1990s comic book boom wasn't built on just readership. It was fueled by speculation. Creators were buying multiple copies of issues, especially those with collectible gimmicks like foil covers or special editions, hoping they would be worth a fortune someday. Neil Gaiman, writer of the hit comic Sandman, warned about this at a 1993 retailer meeting, comparing it to the Dutch tulip mania of the 1600s. He said, "You can sell lots of comics to the same person, especially if you tell them that you are investing money for high guaranteed returns, but you're selling bubbles and tulips, and one day the bubble will burst." By 1996, comic sales had plummeted by 70%. Hundreds of comic stores went out of business, but Marvel's problems went beyond the collapsing market.
How about some brand new technology?
You see, 7 years earlier, financier Ron Perelman had purchased Marvel for $82.5 million through his company, McAndrews & Forbes. Perelman took Marvel public and engaged in aggressive acquisition strategies, buying trading card companies, toy manufacturers, and other assets. He loaded the company with debt in the process. When the speculator bubble burst, Marvel's revenue collapsed. In December 1996, Marvel's executives gathered in nearly empty offices. The company's stock fell from $35.75 in 1993 to $2.38 in 1996. Marvel found itself $610 million in debt. The company that had created some of the world's most beloved characters now faced their greatest villain yet, bankruptcy. What followed was a corporate battle as dramatic as any superhero comic. Perelman, investor Carl Icahn, and the executives of toy company Toy Biz all fought for control of Marvel. In the end, Toy Biz executives Isaac Perlmutter and Avi Arad emerged as the new owners of Marvel Entertainment after a 2-year court battle. They merged Toy Biz with Marvel to create a stronger company, but Marvel would pay a high price for survival. To stay afloat during the bankruptcy, the company has sold off film rights to many of its most valuable characters. Spider-Man went to Sony Pictures, the X-Men and Fantastic Four went to 20th Century Fox, Blade went to New Line Cinema, the Hulk went to Universal. When Blade made $70 million at the box office, Marvel received just $25,000. Even as X-Men and Spider-Man became movie blockbusters, Marvel saw only a tiny fraction of the profits. Avi Arad later lamented, "We were giving away the best part of our business." But then, in 2003, a Marvel executive named David Maisel approached Perlmutter with a radical idea that would change everything. David Maisel's proposal was bold. What if Marvel produced its own movies instead of licensing the rights to other studios? And if Marvel made its own movies, why couldn't the stories cross over with each other, just like they did in the comics? This was incredibly risky. Marvel didn't have its A-list characters available. No Spider-Man, no X-Men, just what many considered B-list heroes like Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America. So in 2005, Marvel struck an unprecedented deal with Merrill Lynch. They secured a $525 million loan to fund 10 movies, offering up their remaining characters as a guarantee. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the films failed, Marvel would lose the rights to characters like Iron Man and Thor. Wall Street analysts called it financial suicide. For their first film, Marvel went all in on Iron Man, with Jon Favreau directing. For their lead role of Tony Stark, Favreau insisted on casting Robert Downey Jr., whose career had been wrecked by substance abuse problems. Marvel executives initially rejected Downey. They saw him as unreliable and too risky for a $140 million gamble. But Favreau persistently fought for him, believing Downey's personal struggles would bring authenticity to the character. On May 2, 2008, every Marvel executive sat in the premiere release completely covered in sweat. Their entire future rested on the audience's reaction in the next 2 hours of footage. The result? Iron Man opened to rave reviews and a massive box office. It made $585 million worldwide, with a $140 million budget. What's more, a 42-second post-credit scene featuring Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury planted the seed for something much bigger. This was the beginning of what would become known as the Marvel Cinematic Universe, a series of interconnected films sharing the same continuity, just like the comics had done for decades. But Iron Man's unexpected success would catch the attention of someone no one saw coming. Just a year after the first Iron Man film, Disney acquired Marvel Entertainment for $4 billion. This deal, once considered overvalued, would prove to be one of the best entertainment acquisitions in history, because 3 years later, Marvel released The Avengers, bringing together characters from previous films in an unprecedented crossover event. It grossed over $1.5 billion worldwide. With Disney's resources behind them and under the guidance of producer Kevin Feige, Marvel Studios continued to expand its cinematic universe. Every studio tried to copy Marvel's cinematic universe formula, but none succeeded. Marvel's secret wasn't just interconnected stories, it was finding visionary directors and giving them the freedom to tell their stories. When Marvel hired James Gunn to direct the Guardians of the Galaxy, a space opera with a talking raccoon and a sentient tree, many thought they'd finally gone too far. But no, the film earned $773 million globally and transcended the MCU into cosmic territory. Marvel's approach paid off again when they hired Ryan Coogler, who had only made 2 indie films, to direct Black Panther. The film broke cultural barriers and earned $1.3 billion worldwide. After 10 years and 20 films, Marvel Studios had built something unprecedented in cinema history, an interconnected series of films all building towards one massive conclusion. But what would happen next would completely change the future of the company. Avengers Infinity War in 2018 and Avengers Endgame in 2019 would serve as the culmination of what Marvel called the Infinity Saga. The anticipation was unlike anything the film industry had seen. Endgame broke records for ticket sales, crashing websites as fans rushed to secure open opening weekend seats. When Avengers Endgame premiered on April 26, 2019, it shattered every box office record in existence. It made $1.2 billion globally in its opening weekend alone, the first film ever to cross the billion-dollar mark in its debut. Disney released Endgame in more theaters than any film before it, 4,662 in just the US and Canada. Some theaters even ran a 24-hour showing to meet demand. Endgame eventually grossed $2.8 billion worldwide, briefly becoming the highest-grossing film of all time. The film that Stan Lee's comic company made after emerging from bankruptcy had become the most commercially successful film in cinema history. Stan Lee, who had appeared in cameo roles in every Marvel film, passed away in November 2018 at age 95, just months before Endgame was released. He never saw the ultimate culmination of what he had started. The once failed writer who never wrote his great American novel, instead created by accident something far more timeless. But this wasn't the only everyday product that became a global phenomenon by accident. Click on this video to see how the failure of one man gave us a billion-dollar habit we can't quit.